Welcome everybody to another Friday seminar. We have a presenter from UQ Business School, John Steen. He is Associate Professor of Strategic Analysis, and he will give us a talk about organizational and cultural barriers to achieving integrated mining operations. John, next one is yours.
Okay. It's great to be here at JK Centre. It's actually my first time here, so while I've had a lot of interactions with SMI over the years, been on supervisory committees for PhD students, a couple of research projects that we've worked on together with a few people over there, and that's actually growing as well, but this is my first time to JK, so it's actually really nice to be here. The presentation I'm going to give today, it's a little bit unusual in that I'm trying to give an overview of where we've come from with our work, I guess, looking at what's happened to mining in the last several years. But some of that will be our own empirical research, and some of it will also be work done by others around us, like someone up in the School of Economics, a guy called Chris O'Donnell, who looks at productivity analysis, so I'll refer to his work a bit. Also to the work of Chris Baran and his PhD student Nadia Kun, so you might have seen the network analysis that they've done looking at collaboration patterns inside a mine site. And I'll also be drawing on those different strands to I guess, paint a picture. The other piece of work that we've done, you'll see the Ernst & Young logo. I'm not actually employed by Ernst & Young, but it's just so hard to undo their PowerPoint formats. It seems to be a corporate thing. You can't selectively change some of their stuff. As soon as you try to change something, it all goes haywire. I think it's some sort of IP thing that's going on there. But we have been working with Ernst & Young in a collaborative sense. If you don't know about Ernst & Young, they're well known for their accounting side and auditing and risk management, but they're also got a very large consulting advisory side. So we've been able to get access to some very senior mining executives in a way that we wouldn't normally do ourselves. They audit a lot of these businesses, and one of the pieces of work we did last year was a series of interviews with a number of mining executives around the world about what had happened to create the productivity crisis as they saw it. So there's a whole lot of strands that I'm going to bring together. Very happy to take comments along the way. It's a very informal talk. I actually enjoy being interrupted a bit because my coffee's still hot, so I can have a sip of coffee along the way. Okay, so very informal. By way of background, our group at the UQ Business School, we've got a very large innovation group that's been there since 2003. Probably, if you go back, it's got actually traces its origins right through to the School of Engineering and the Technology and Innovation Management Centre, which was led by Professor Mark Dodgson, who, if you listen to Radio National, you've heard him on the Robin Williams Science Program several times. Really a big international figure on innovation. It was about 2007, I think, when we started getting into contact with miners. So, particularly around the area of internal coordination and collaboration. So at the time we were doing network analysis. We just won an ARC Discovery grant. We were doing a corporate education seminar. There was someone from Rio Tinto there. They saw our network analysis of communication patterns. They said, "Oh, you've got to talk to these guys who are working on internal collaboration. They've really got to see this." So that really kicked off our first substantive piece of research looking at mining businesses. And it's really kicked on from there, looking at network analysis. How does performance incentives change behaviour in a mine site for better and for worse? And now we're looking at a whole range of things, particularly the most promising, I'll talk about this right at the end, but I think the most promising thing we're looking at going forward is how do technical factors and people factors interact? So normally these are looked at quite separately. If you're like a Deloitte or a McKinsey, you almost exclusively look at the people side, mainly because you don't know a hell of a lot about the technical side. But if you're on the technical side, you're a technical consultant or an engineer, usually the people issues are the things you sort of park off to one side. I think there's a lot of prospects for actually bringing those things together and looking at that in collaboration, in harmony, how they work together. So I think you can't solve one without the other. We'll talk about that later. So, just a bit of background, and this is stuff that you all know, obviously being in the industry. This is the report that we did with Ernst & Young based on, there's about 60 interviews with executives in you'd know all the companies if I mention them. They're all the big companies that are around the world. And they all mention very similar things. It's interesting when I think when university people talk to executives, they sort of let their guard down a bit. If it's consultants, they'll the shutters will come a bit, but because if you're a sort of a fairly mostly harmless junior professor, they'll be quite open with what they think went wrong. And they talk a lot about financially undisciplined growth. It was almost growth at any cost. So whatever it took to get that extra ton out of the ground, they did it, with not a lot of thought of the consequences. Right. And I'm sure if you think back to 2011, after China started pumping its economy back up, and there was this massive rebound in commodity prices. If you're out there on the mine sites, a few of our colleagues were actually down in the Hunter Valley at the time, and it was all hands on deck. Whatever it took to get that extra ton of coal out of the ground, you did it. And we worked out the consequences later on. It was quite a remarkable environment. In addition, there was very high turnover in the industry, fly in, fly out. So what used to be, you talk to the miners about this, what used to be very cohesive type units, you really didn't know who you're going to be working with next week. You really didn't know who was on the next shift. Right? So there's all these organisational problems coming in. A lot of executives that we talk to talk about the loss of that old operational excellence culture that they built up in the 1990s. So there's, if you talk to someone at the sea level, they've usually been in the mining game for decades. Okay. And one talked about, just to look at it in terms of asset utilisation equipment, we've gone from not 90% down to low 90s down to mid 80s in terms of how we use our fleet. Right? He said, look, it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're looking at a really fine margin mining game, that translates into a lot of money. We've just lost the ability to control our operations. The other thing that came out, which was quite interesting, and I'll pick up this theme in a few different ways later on, was a couple of managers, and these are the more thoughtful people. You probably know them if I mention them, but you sign confidentiality agreements, you can't actually mention names. But they talked about, look, we got larger and larger, and it got very complicated. So we assumed that as we expanded, the same economics would be in place. We'd get these economies of scale. And instead, they never performed to expectations, or a lot of these expansion programs. So a couple of execs actually talked about diseconomies of scale. So the complexity of these very large operations that expanded quickly was overwhelming for the people who were trying to control them. So that's quite interesting. That was what we saw when we talked to the execs. But going back to the economists, and this is the dry economist view that you see touted around the discussion papers, Australian Bureau of Statistics, the Productivity Commission. What they are able to see is sort of headline changes, but they don't really understand what's going on. So this is work, I've sort of summarised it. If you want to go back to Chris O'Donnell's work in productivity analysis, it's a very interesting read, but you have to have a hell of a lot of math to do it. It's beyond me. So I've just taken out some of the headline graphs and sort of, I'll talk to his point of view as best I can understand it. I'm sure Chris would be horrified, but no, I'm not here. So what they talked about is a decline in total factor productivity. So total factor productivity is all of the inputs into making a mine work. And they say, yeah, sure, it's declined pretty much through the boom. There's been a very steady decline. So Chris's trick, and he's world famous for doing this. He's got several thousand citations to his papers for working out how to do this. I don't understand it. He does. That's okay. He said, look, if you look at the technical component, the technical efficiency component of that productivity decline, technical efficiency, the role of technology, actually isn't a problem. So in terms of the technology that we put into place, the plant, equipment, that's pretty well as productive as ever. But he's got this other factor in here which he calls scale and mix, the effects of expansion, the effects of diversification. And he's saying, look, when I break down this total factor productivity headline into its components, it's scale and mix, scale and diversification, which is the real problem. I saw this. I went upstairs. Chris is sort of just upstairs from me down at St Lucia, and I said, Chris, this is fantastic because it aligns beautifully with what our managers are telling us from these executive interviews. And he said, well, no, that's not what's going on. They just did bad businesses. They mined more and more marginal grades of ore. We sort of had this debate. Chris still doesn't believe that there's actually very deep organisational issues that underpin this economies of scale problem, the grey line. But I think it's very much an organisational issue. Another piece of evidence that I like from Chris that he sort of doesn't agree with me on. If we look at that decline in scale and mix, a lot of it's labour. So DL is declines in labour productivity. So if you like, the Hercule Poirot whodunit is labour at scale, how we work at scale, how we've deployed people through this scale up has been incredibly inefficient. So undoubtedly there's some technical issues, but the underlying whodunit is how we've organised to scale up during the boom. And the legacy of that has been very hard to undo, and miners are trying to undo that at the moment. So I think if you take Chris's economic data, which is very separate from my interview data, it tells a fairly convincing story, I think. When times were lean, when the commodity prices weren't as high as they are, organisations become very focused. When you're going through hard times consistently year after year, you get efficient. You do get efficient. But it was the scale and diversification, the diseconomies of scale, the problems of organising that really underpin the productivity crisis we're seeing now in the mining sector. So productivity is, what I'm saying is that productivity is quintessentially an organisational problem. It's how we organise the mining business. That's where a lot of the productivity has been lost. So they talk about the productivity challenge in mining, inputs for outputs. A lot of it's to do with the bad scale-up processes and how these organisations were run, particularly during the boom phase.
So you asked to be interrupted, so you
sure.
Drink your coffee.
Please. Thanks for reminding me.
I don't understand how the labour productivity kind of links with the productivity of scale. Is it something to do with, because I would assume that if the equipment gets bigger, you require less people to operate it, because it's less fiddly.
Yeah.
Is it just they get paid more, or is it that there are more of them?
That's an interesting point. So, first point is that productivity is independent of, the way the economists think about it, it's independent of cost. So cost isn't a factor. Productivity is always measured in inputs, so labour hours, and outputs, tonnes of coal. So the question about the equipment, one really interesting fact in the mining industry, which is often overlooked, is in absolute terms, labour productivity in mining is very high. Because what have you got? You never have someone with a beach spade shoveling coal. It's someone with a bloody great dragline. So that person, because they're matched with capital, equipment, that person in absolute terms is very productive. But what Chris has been able to show is that productivity has in fact declined. And you also hear the managers talking about unskilled people coming onto the job quickly because they just needed warm bodies in the mine site with minimal training. So if you think about it, if you've got a drag line doing hundreds of swings a day, and if you've got someone who's slightly not as good as their drag line operator, that translates into a lot of tonne of coal. So Chris is saying, look, the labour that's the labour productivity that you can drive it down to really look at skills. Yeah. Does that make sense? So I'm giving you the John Steen limited understanding version of productivity economics. But Chris's papers are also available. This being able to break down productivity into components is actually very revealing, because it sort of tells you a story about in the mining industry that you couldn't see from the headline figures. Headline figures show productivity's decline. And even if you look at the Australian Bureau of Statistics discussion papers, there's a debate going on with those economists saying, is that real? You know, and talking to Chris O'Donnell again after a conference he hosted in Brisbane, he said, there's this huge debate. A lot of people just don't believe the numbers. A lot of people just don't believe the numbers. And the missing variable is ore grades. How do we correct for ore grades in all this? So, yeah, it's a complicated thing.
I guess just following up on that, I work for an organisation that employed 6,000 people in the early 1980s, and by 2002 that was down to around 2,000 people. The output had increased by about 50% over that time. What I've seen since then is what you said before about lack of skills. It's not so much the fact that companies have more people, it's the fact that they don't have enough skills to actually operate, whether they're technical skills, management skills.
Yeah.
Young people getting moved into management roles very early without having the technical background, so they don't actually know what they're managing. So those things have been a significant problem from what I've seen in the last decade.
Absolutely. I mean, some follow-up discussions. There's an HR manager at Glencore is saying the same things. He says, I've got people working for me now who are senior managers who weren't here before 2003. They've got no idea what it's like to operate in a low commodity price environment. It's a massive shock for them.
And for many people, they've got no idea what it's like to operate a plant power. They haven't seen success.
Yes. Yeah, and that's almost a direct quote from a CFO of a global company who said the same. There's a common view in the industry.
Is the loss of productivity, is that only an Australian phenomenon to that extent?
No.
Or is it a global?
It's a global phenomenon. It is a global. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but globally it's a problem. So this conversation will resonate, or has resonated in Indaba, and EY are taking this on a roadshow to Canada as well. It's the same conversation.
I don't have economic background, but sorry if I simplify the problem. So, if I understood correctly, we can correlate productivity with margins that some company earn per unit of product. Am I right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
if the productivity is low, that margin is less. Your cost or whatever.
They don't talk about costs, but they do talk about the national accounts with inputs and outputs. So at an industry level.
My question is whether that increase in productivity was sacrificed to increase the throughput in order to increase the profit.
Yeah, and this is the undoubtedly that was going on. And talking to Chris O'Donnell, he says, I don't know why you're getting excited, because all that will happen is the price will fall, and these companies being economically rational will reduce their activity, they'll mine better grade ores, and everything will be fixed quickly. But there's a component of that, they did sacrifice productivity for profit, but the way in which that was done is quite interesting. It's not just they chose to go after lower grade ore deposits. It's also that they didn't organise properly, the skills were lost, the culture. There's a very deep organisational question. So at a higher level, yes, at the deeper level, there's a very interesting story that the economists often miss. But you're absolutely right. Your interpretation is correct.
John, when you come to the issue of the labour coming into the expanding organisations, we know buildings were full of people in Brisbane that were working on projects that may never happen, and that labour cost is slated against the company cost.
Yeah.
So some of those projects started to happen, a lot of them just got cut but all that labour expenditure occurred throughout that same period. Is that separated out?
Yeah, it is. It is. So, I mean, one of the challenges around productivity analysis is that you have labour productivity and capital productivity, which is, and at an expansion stage when you're working on big projects. You know, the oil and gas projects are classics. When you're building a $20 billion LNG operation, it's not operational for 4 years, so your output is zero. So you've got to sort of correct for that, and they do that. Yeah, but that's important.
We've just come off one of the biggest booms forever. Is there any evidence that suggests that this problem that we're seeing now has been present in downturns, previous downturns, significant downturns, where you've had labour productivity decline?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, across industries, there's always a relationship between boom and lower productivity. You know, and even if you're not a productivity economist, you can talk about the risks that always build up in industries in the boom. You think about, I think it was the economist, Canadian economist John Galbraith. Yeah. He wrote about 1927, you know, the expansion of the 1920s and the Great Crash. And all the sharp practice, the bad accounting, the unskilled people that came in led up to that crash. And the same thing happened with the subprime mortgage crisis. So it's a common theme. You know, booms are always very bad for business.
So these are predictable events.
Yeah, particularly in hindsight. But you know, you sort of, you know, you can have a conversation with an executive saying you knew this was going to happen. But when you're in the middle of it and your shareholders are pushing you, and you know you're in this environment of, you know, it's you sort of, how long can we keep going before it stops? You know, there's never a bell at the top. You know, you never get an SMS saying it's the crashes tomorrow. And then you get people like there was the CEO of Oz Minerals saying, "Not stronger for longer, stronger forever." You know, remember that? That's a quote we forgot.
The wrong problem about him saying that it wasn't resources boom, it was resources plateau.
Well, yeah. I mean, the whole productivity story is really interesting. So it's a bit of a shame it's hijacked by the dry economists, because at a deeper level there's this very interesting phenomena that really worth looking at. But I'll continue. This is work done by Castell and Nadia Kuntz and Chris Moran, and it just, I think it fits in nicely here. It's published in the Journal of Clean Production, because it really shows how discoordinated these mines really became. This is one particular large mining operation, and you know, when you talk to managers, they talk about silos, but when you see it in terms of communication patterns, so if you like, each of these dots is a person, and you ask them questions in a survey. You know, who do you go to for information? Who do you go to solve problems to get help? And you start to realise that actually the connections between these two critical functions is quite low. What was even more surprising, you know, the key issue of water management, and this is in the paper, completely disconnected. And the managers didn't really know about that. I think, and Chris tells the story that he was talking to the sponsor, who was one of the few connecting points, and he said, "Look, you know, do you realise why you're on the phone to me? No one's managing water at your company." No, but just these breakdowns in communication were really overlooked. I think some of it's to do with you know, mining culturally, but very operationally based. But you know, the expansion and the rapid turnover in people in the industry didn't help. So again, more evidence of the problems in organising. This is a nice piece of work. It was done by the University of Western Australia. You might have seen this one, it just came out a couple of weeks ago. David Brereton showed it to me. But miners are aware that there are long-term pressures, there are long-term problems. So unlike the economists, they say, yeah, okay, we're probably in the low point of the cycle, but underneath that there are some really long-term pressures that we have to deal with. They're aware of the, if you took just the mining rather than services, I'll just deal with the miners. So these are responses from senior mine managers and executives. decreasing ore body grades, right? Price pressure is right up there at the moment. Energy costs, social licence, you know, they recognise that they're not in a cyclical. No, these are not cyclical problems. Pricing is probably a cyclical problem. Labour might be a bit cyclical, but there's some very deep underlying issues that need to be solved. So I guess when we talk to the miners now, and also hearing this from EY, there's a real understanding that, okay, we've been through the boom, we've managed it badly, and now is the time to actually do something different. We need a new business model for mining, because the challenges that we're facing are actually long-term structural problems. So miners are starting to look at innovation, but innovation in the mining context is a really tricky conversation to have, because by and large, particularly at the mine sites, it's just not part of the culture. So when Tim Castell, Sam McCauley, who's a shared fellow between UK Business School and SMI, when we went out to a large coal mine, we met with the business improvement people, and we talked about, we want to know about innovation. You know, what innovations have you introduced that have really made a difference to this particular mine site? And it was a very blunt response from the business improvement people. They said, well, we don't do innovation, it's just too risky. That's not something I can ever see happening in our business. Right? On the other hand, when we went down into the mine and we just talked to the dragline operator who'd just come off shift, he was very happy to talk about all the innovations they've introduced in the last year in the dragline. And I looked at the business improvement guy and he looked at me and said, what? No, there's not a coherent view internally about what innovation is. So culturally there's a problem to introducing innovation to address these long-term changes. And we know that innovation is, like organisation, is also a people issue. It's not just about the technology. If you look at all these are Procter & Gamble, Kodak, these are examples from outside the mining industry, but looking at innovation just purely as a technological problem really leads you down the wrong path. So the culture around innovation in mining, particularly at the operational areas, really needs to change as well. This is another slide that we did with Ernst & Young, trying to think about different types of innovation that might affect mining. And I think it's to try and get that language around innovation into the industry, we differentiated between incremental innovation. So when you have, we watched a lot of the introduction of lean inside Rio Tinto, and that's an organisational innovation, right? Making sure that information gets passed from shift to shift, that people can see on the lean boards how they're performing, that they can introduce changes to make the yellow or red go to green. That is a form of innovation. It's not new to the industry, but it's new to that particular company. And then you can look right through to radical innovation, the things that you work with. I'm really interested in the in-situ leach mining, the whole mine of the future portfolio, which we'll see how that goes now. Automation, 3D printing parts on site. So if you look at incremental right through to radical. The other important thing, I think, and this is particularly important for mining, is that we can look at innovations that affect one particular function or a range of operations across the mine value chain. So things that affect procurement, parts, vendor managed inventory, training, right? Virtual reality. But some innovations actually affect multiple parts of the mine value chain. And talking to some of your colleagues, it's really these ones, I think, that are the big prize. The ability to integrate, technically, different functions within the mine. So, I mean, John and Emmy talk about value sequencing, that sort of idea. I know the CRCO talks about great engineering. That sort of, how do we think about technical solutions across the whole value chain? So that's probably where the big prize is. But on the other hand, we're not seeing innovation closely linked to strategy. So we know the prize is that there's really big transformational pieces across the mine site, across the business. But the mining managers are saying, well, actually, we don't have a clear view on innovation, on what's important. This might be changing in some companies. You see some movement coming out of Anglo now, but the supportive culture, the deliberate space for innovation in operations, partnership models. They're saying, look, we tend to think about innovation in a very piecemeal way. And that's a problem, because when you're trying to introduce those really big pieces across a mine site, if these things aren't in place, it's going to be very hard to make that work. Most significantly, when you're introducing a change, a new technology, getting people to work differently, it affects what people do. The people have to change. So this is a really interesting response to, okay, success rates across the industry are low. Why do you think? This is implementation of innovations, ineffective change management. We've got the technology in place, we haven't got the people ready for it. We haven't got them to think differently. Right? We've changed the technology, we haven't changed the people. And I think that's where I'm saying where the future, a lot of the stuff we can work at is that interaction between technology and people across the mine site. So I'd just like to finish off with a piece of work that we did as part of Sam McCauley's PhD. It's currently under review for a journal called Organisational Science. It's sort of a management studies journal. But when we, and this was funded by an ARC Discovery Grant, which we won in 2008 or something. But when we initially went into Rio Tinto, we went in with the idea that we'd do a whole lot of network studies, and the technical manager at the time, very excited by that, he said, look, we're really trying to build collaboration inside Rio Tinto Coal, and you would actually enable us to understand how that collaboration is working. So we went in with a view that we do a whole lot of network analyses, and we did do that, but the study actually turned into something quite different, and I think it speaks to an underlying culture inside mining that really needs to be changed if we're going to get this sort of whole of mine solution and introduce new technologies. I think it really shows how far we have to drive this. So initially we were interested in this idea of search. You know, when you're in an organisation, something's not working, you usually go to someone to get the solution. I mean, these days, you can get using the search online as well, but technically you often go to try and find a colleague. It seems like in any large organisation, this isn't straightforward. So searching for answers to problems, particularly when you've got a performance gap. So management studies people are very interested in how search happens. Okay, so if my MTBF figures are below those of mine site X, I get a bit of grief for that. How do I actually make that better? So that's a classic search problem. Right. So we did our little network analyses. We could show the diagrams a bit like Nadia showed you. But as we'd interview people, we found some really interesting things. And the rational view of search is that, well, that's all right. There's a whole lot of experts out there. If I know you're there, I'll just go to you. The reality was, in the culture of the mine site, that was a fairly rare thing. It didn't always happen that way. And the reasons why it happened were as we went through it, we sort of did a sort of an ethnographic study. You go to a country and you find out about cultures, and you find some surprising things. If you go into an organisation, it's a bit like being a visitor to another culture. The things that you assume aren't actually quite correct. So we heard a lot of interesting stories, and the more we got involved in this and talked to people, the more interesting it got. So initially we were focusing on the idea that search was pretty straightforward. We asked people about their social networks, how they were using technology, particularly an online collaboration tool that was in place at the time. But then some really interesting things started coming up, and people said, "Look, actually, I've got to be really careful who I ask this question to, because essentially what they're saying is, if I ask you a question, I'm also telling you what I don't know. It's risky in some environments to ask questions. University couldn't know that. We're all flagged. Who's laughing? So, a lot of internal culture around rivalry, internal competition, and the need to preserve your status as an expert made people very careful about how they ask questions, how they search for knowledge. So what we found sometimes, we assume that there would be a local bias search. You go to the closest person available that you knew of. What would often happen is that they would go to a contact who wouldn't be a threat. Even if it was in another mine site, they'd pick up the phone and talk to them, rather than lose face by asking a question that they thought they might know. So we had people talking to us about sibling rivalry, different groups, different mine sites being very competitive with each other. One interviewee said, "Look, you think it wouldn't work like this, but actually I'm opening myself up to risk. If I expose my limits of knowledge, it's a risky thing for me to do." So we started actually building a model of how this occurred. So about 38 interviews, participant observation, a whole lot of discussion. There's about 2 years of work behind this. And as you see, Sam and I are very at home in the mine. We look like we're natives and what, but we spent a lot of time. It was interesting, we learned a lot on the mine site, but afterwards, you have a meal at the pub in Claremont or whatever, and people actually tell you a whole lot more. You can't record them, but you take notes. But the whole issue was around this problem of risk in searching for knowledge. And the way we thought about it was, well, actually there's a paradox of equivalence in these organisations. If someone on a different mine site is doing a similar job to me, they can be an incredible resource. But on the other hand, I'm also going to be compared to them. So that person on the other mine site, that other maintenance engineer, is a resource and also a threat at the same time. So there's equivalence in learning, you're an opportunity to learn, but you're also a rival. And when you go through these processes, you've got to be seen to be performing well in terms of personal reward, in terms of how is there a budget for me? Will that capital be allocated for me to work on my business? So that whole issue around equivalence actually created rivalry because of how people were rewarded. So you'd think that the superintendent of maintenance on site 1 would usually have most gain by targeting the search in site, it's equivalent to site 2, but that didn't happen because this threat of rivalry and comparison. And the interesting part of that is that it's assumed in these organisations that all of this competitive analysis, benchmarking is a really good thing, it drives performance. But what we were actually seeing is it creates fairly pathological behaviours. There's a lot of expertise, a lot of knowledge that gets generated every day on the mine site, but it's not being shared because of this instance of rivalry. And they'd actually go to competitors or even people who didn't understand the job as well as someone, the obvious target would. Yeah. And a lot of it's underpinned by competing for resources. And this creates a really friction-driven environment. You get very colourful language. One of our great satisfactions is being able to put dick measuring competitions in the journal article. Good night, happily now. Pissing contests, chest beating exercises. You know, it really affects how they interact with each other. And we saw a lot of that. In fact, one particular group we were going to study at a particular mine site, we're all ready to go, flying out, and they said, no, it's off. So what happened? Oh, I'll tell you later. So about a week later, we found out what happened. There'd actually been a sort of a civil war broke out of this mine site based on someone not believing someone else's figures, different teams. So this rivalry is really intense. Okay. But the whole upshot is, I see the environment as risk. It's going to be hard for me to ask questions. I affiliate with my team. I don't affiliate with the mine. It's a very balkanised environment that gets created by this sort of rivalry. And it also means that my search environment is not benign. I've got to be very careful how I search. So, I think theoretically this might sound, that's a bit abstract, but you think about all the problems that need to be solved on a day-to-day basis. And if it takes an hour, 2 hours, a day longer to solve a problem, think about how that translates into costs and lost productivity. These cultural aspects are actually very deep drivers of performance problems. So I'm really making a case that, with a very in-depth study, that don't ignore the organisational factors. You think about the losses here. So just to tie things up, I think there's a lot of work to be done on the interaction of technical and organisational factors. That's a very exciting area, particularly as how we deal with large, complicated operations. I think the miners would love us to look at how do we balance individual versus mine performance. We just had this conversation with a particular executive over and over again. He said, look, I know how to reward individuals. How do I align that to the mine? It sounds straightforward, but he'd been wrestling with this for years. Along with that, optimisation of a particular function versus optimisation of the mine. And a lot of you would know about that. And we've had mine managers say, look, wouldn't it be fantastic if the person doing drill and blast understood what they were doing and how that actually affected the people doing load and haul and how that affected the comminution activity. And, wouldn't it be fantastic if they all understood how their role fitted everything else? So we still don't have that. And I think the other issue, and this is a project we've got, a piece of work we've got as a grant proposal in front of the Project Management Institute, is how do managers deal with emergent complexity in real time? So what's their capacity to respond to information as it comes up? A lot of our executives said that this skill of managing in complicated environments is a rare thing. There's not a lot of managers who are really trained to think systemically across the mine. But he said, one guy said, look, but when we see them, we hang on to them for dear life because they drive a hell of a lot of performance in that business. So I think these are the future issues. And I'm really pleased to say that there's a new dialogue with SMI. And CY still there. But they see these issues as being important as well, and as does the industry that we talk with. So watch this space. I think it's a very exciting area to be involved with. And that concludes my formal talk. My coffee's gone cold, you haven't interrupted me enough. But happy to take questions or comments.
Go back to that slide where you had the bar chart showing reasons why technology...
The implementation.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yep.
Anywhere in there it says that technology doesn't work. people have invested a lot in technology and it's just not worked.
Yeah. I mean, the report isn't perfect. I probably would have designed the questions in a different way. But you're right. You know, you can probably see it coming out in here, and I think that's a. You know, if you and I designed it, we'd probably do a slightly different job. But I think the top two are very pertinent. Yeah. Top three.
Another question. What do you think needs to change the very short-term output, purely economically driven or day-to-day economically driven outcome of mining to a more holistic long-term? I mean, it all is driven in the end by money. It's just whether it's a day-to-day cash or if it's a long investment. Who and where, what needs to be changed to do that? Because as long as drivers are not in place for a holistic view, no one will do that because it's costs more money initially.
I mean, you know, getting to that corporate level governance of these companies, that's such an interesting question. You know, you could say, okay, well, it's just to do with the shareholder structure. The shareholders want short returns. But on the other hand, you have examples not in the mining industry, but other companies where there's almost a tacit agreement that yes, you will spend 30% of your revenues on R&D because you've earned the right to do it. We know that you deliver on this. We're patient, and that's the Cochlear story. So, how does the relationship with shareholders and miners change? I think that's a very complicated thing. Miners, from time to time, don't necessarily respond to their shareholders either. So, if you look at the Rio example of Alcan, that wasn't in shareholder interests. That was in the executives' interests. How do we preserve our jobs? The poison pill. So, it's a really, really interesting area, and the compact between shareholders, the board, and the executives is, and a mandate for this. It's something I'd like to spend more time thinking about. I think it's part of the key to unlocking. How do we turn this into an innovation-driven industry? Because as Mark Cutifani says, look, if we continue on the current rate, we're going to be a subsidiary of GE. They know there's a problem. Yeah, it's a good question.
The individual versus the company performance, the term that I dislike for passion is KPIs.
Yeah.
Because it's a local measure that actually prevents the aspiration to help the total business.
Yeah.
Have you done any work or?
It's interesting you mentioned that. There's actually a dialogue I'm having with what's his name? I'm not that old. But the new professor, Rodney Wolf, it's something he's interested in as well. And I think if those KPIs and they're being so localised really affects how you think. So there's a sort of almost like a psychological aspect that's dysfunctional about that. So it's a discussion. We're thinking, what would a project look like about that? But we know the individual incentives are a problem. They drive dysfunctional behaviours.
One of the things is you can have a KPI style structure that the reward is related to the productivity of something you get down the chain. That it only works if the link is made abundantly clear.
Yeah.
I'll just say you're responsible for that, and they don't know how.
That's right.
And they just want to beat up the guy for not being accomplishing.
Shit.
They need to understand their contribution to that, and that weighting is weighted to what they do.
That's right.
It's like almost an obvious way that you can link them, but it's just not in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's being able to understand that there's a data part of this as well. Being able to visualise how what you're doing now affects. So there's a data and visualisation piece there as well. You can look to other industries that do this quite well. Toyota have been doing it for years. If you're on the shop floor of Toyota, you know what it looks like further down the track. Even a meat abattoir. For my sins, I was consulting to a meat company for a while. Getting hit by carcasses, there's been on the shop floor. But if someone knows how they're boning and they get direct feedback as to how that's affecting the cuts of meat at the end. It is possible. You can make the links obvious to even fairly low-skilled workers like abattoir workers. So you think it might be possible more. Sorry.
Just around skills area, I guess it's pretty obvious we're moving from a period of skills shortage to skills surplus.
Yeah.
When or how do you think we'll see the manifestation of the impact of that on productivity? Because you should be able to employ the best people now.
Yeah.
That'll give you a better operation.
To some extent, it's happening now already. There's sort of, if you like, different phases of productivity repair. So there's the cost-cutting phase, and they've sort of gone through a lot of that. And then there's going to be a phase around, yesterday to someone at the Asia Pac mining and metals manager for White, says that there's going to become a capital sustained phase. What do we need to do with plant and equipment to make sure that the people we've got in place are doing the right thing? But I think in the long term, there's sort of short-term things, but there's also long-term things. There's a view that the managers of the future will need to have different skills.
But if a lot of the issue is how well people work, which is the labour productivity.
Yeah.
If you get rid of the people that don't work well, you should see
a bounce.
a big bounce.
Yeah. And I think they have got that big bounce that has turned around. But in the longer term, the challenges will mean that's a bounce in a long-term declining trend, unless there's a change to do something different in terms of a deeper change in how mining is done.
I guess one of the things I've sort of noticed is there's been a huge lack of investment in development of career professions. And the solution to that during the boom is we'll just import a whole lot of labour. And the young professionals are still not being given development. There's a whole lot of issues around the labour market.
Yeah. Some people are thinking about this, particularly in the smarter HR managers. They're saying, actually, it's not just a case we can hire people now. Can we hire the right people? And the other piece is that miners, it's a very ageing workforce. People with a lot of experience are on the verge of retirement, and there aren't people coming through to replace them.
Because people are hanging on to their jobs. There's no incentive to bring in essentially trainees. Because people are holding on to jobs they don't want. Other people around who are going to take a part of the job.
I mean,
There's going to be problems that come out.
it seems like the skills thing, we're almost putting in place the seeds for another skills crisis. Following on from the work we did last year with EY, they put out a particular report on skills, and that cost cutting and delabouring isn't a long-term solution.
No, it's like Glencore was a particular example.
Well, maybe I'll just comment on that. The mentoring roles were introduced in the past, and for some reason that has been lost. So the older engineers, they don't pass the knowledge, and they know that as time is passing by, things are changing. It's becoming more and more difficult to actually keep up. And one of the reasons would be, that's why you have junior who actually pass the knowledge, and they can update you with the new technologies. They're the one that they can actually bring new things. So that synergy should work much better. But when you comment that they're keeping their jobs, there is not that much of a passing information to the right people who can actually then continue. And not only that, they have the historical data and all necessary skills now to actually continue working on that.
I think there's a whole lot more that needs to be said and done around the skills area.
I was interested in the rivalry and ridicule kind of stuff.
That's why you're the sociologist, aren't you? I remember you at the doctoral seminar. You're slightly different. In a good way.
The rivalry and ridicule. How did that come about? Is that a competition in the workplace, which can be a positive thing? And how do you change that? And how do you move into somewhere where people feel comfortable asking their neighbour about it?
So I think what we uncovered is sort of sort of, if you like, a subplot that normally isn't revealed to managers, you know. But yeah, it was something that was going on because of the assumption that rivalry was good. Competition was very good. We actually showed, well, actually, if it gets out of hand, it's a problem. And I think that the solution comes back to how do you reward people, sort of individual benefits versus whole of mind benefits, you know, trying to get that balance right again, because a lot of this was tied to individuals. And individuals reinforced individual benefits. So the people who are known to be the guns were the people who you want to work with, and sort of build a team around them. And you didn't want to work with a crap team because they'll take you down. You know. So it's, yeah, I think it's a part of it's a balance of reward systems. That would be the obvious place to start.
There are moves some companies to actually capture information around problem solving
Yeah.
and enterprise-wide type systems
Yeah.
to remove this type of, I guess, friction we're talking about, which then sort of makes it neutral in the sense that anybody who's got the problem, doesn't matter where they are, could then go and interrogate that system to get guidance on how to solve the problem.
Yeah, and that whole area of knowledge management, you know, it's become more and more sophisticated. How was that? Sam McCauley was in the Hunter Valley yesterday, and you know, this particular mining engineering company, I'll give it away, has that sort of system in place. And Sam talked to a mine maintenance manager and said, look, you know, why don't you use that more? And the response was, well, geez, if I've got a good idea, I'm not going to share it with every person. You know. But there's also a view that you've got capital, and if you're not rewarded for it, you can hoard the knowledge capital for yourself. Yeah. So I think it's part of it. It's a very important part, but the underlying issues around culture and incentives is sort of seem to be quite significant. But it's important to realise that our technologies can.
Just as a comment on that, if you read the journals, trade journals, it's quite noticeable that there's been a huge change in what people are prepared to share in recent years compared to the 30s and 40s. So if you look at the Oslo and Bulletin issues, you can find very detailed descriptions of, say, the copper refinery at Townsville, or how MIN changed from lead production to copper production during the war, all sorts of equipment description. Even the 1993 Morris Morley volume has got far more detail and useful information than the most recent one, which is all about stakeholder management and nothing much about our process. So I think there's been a cultural shift, not just within companies, but just generally. You can see that. So in the past, people were much more prepared to share and learn from each other, whereas now it seems to be more of us keep it to ourselves.
I'll share one last story just to sort of tie things up a bit. But when we did the big network analysis of communication, there was one person who was right in the middle, sort of talking to everybody. Obviously a real coordinator, sharer of information. And this was at the end of the project. They said, "Oh, who's that? Who's that?" "Oh, I can't tell you." "But who is it? Who is it?" We said, "Okay, well, we can't tell you exactly, but they're one of the people you fired because they weren't productive enough." You know, so people are being rewarded for the, you know, not being disseminators of useful knowledge. They're being rewarded in very limited ways, and it can cost them their job.
If there are more questions, you're welcome to ask them outside. So let's thank you for that.